Are you passionate about shaping India's future? Keen to find solutions for India's most pressing challenges? Look no further than Taksha postgraduate program in public policy. This 48-weekend program will equip you with the knowledge, skills, and network needed to pivot to a meaningful career in public policy. Apply in the link below by June 1st. The program begins June 20th. Hope to see you there.
Welcome to All Things Policy, a daily podcast by the Takshashila Institution. We are a bunch of policy nerds based in Bengaluru, and we like bringing fresh perspectives to Indian affairs and Indian perspectives to global affairs. So grab a cup of coffee, sit back, and join us for today's chat.
Welcome to today's All Things Policy. I am Brigadier Anil Raman, Research Fellow at the Takshashila Institution, Bengaluru. Today, as part of our series on the Iran war, we shall discuss the strategic logic of US military action, in particular the role and limits of air power and coercion in achieving political objectives. Joining me is Air Marshal P.D. Joseph, former fighter pilot of the Indian Air Force and distinguished fellow at the Takshashila Institution. And our special guest today from the Stimson Center in Washington, D.C. is Dr. Kelly Grieco, Senior Fellow. Dr. Grieco's work with Reimagining U.S. Grand Strategy Program focuses on U.S. foreign policy and defense policy, addressing questions about military strategy, force structure, military alliances, air operations, and the future of war. She has deep expertise in U.S. military alliances and the security architectures of the Indo-Pacific and Europe, as well as current and emerging air power strategies and capabilities, including air denial and drone warfare. She is also an adjunct professor in the Center for Security Studies at Georgetown University and a non-residential fellow at the Marine Corps University. She has been an assistant professor at the Air Command and Staff College and holds a PhD in political science from MIT. She is widely published, including in the Defense News, Foreign Affairs, the New York Times, Strategic Studies Quarterly, etc. In 2024, she received the Christopher Coker Prize for the best paper in the field of security studies for her co-authored article, Can Drones Coerce, which was published in International Politics. In short, I am sure that we could not have had a more qualified candidate to speak about the ongoing US-Iran conflict, in particular on national strategy and air operations. To get the discussion going, Dr. Grieco, may I start with a question as to how you see the US actions in this conflict as part of a coherent theory of limited war or as operational activity without a clearly defined political end state?
Great. Well, I'm glad that you started with an easy question then. Well, first of all, thank you for having me. I really appreciate it. And I'm really looking forward to the opportunity to discuss Airpower with both of you. You asked the right question and a really hard one. What is the goal here? It's very Clausewitz. What is the political objective? And clearly, it was an attempt at limited war. I would say that I think going into the operation initially, I think there was a clear political objective based on the president, and that was regime change. I think he believed that he could apply air power in a decisive, limited way, and it through decapitation, and it would actually result in a change in the regime. When that failed to happen, within about 72 hours, it was clear that that was not actually going to occur. At that point, the administration has struggled to come up with what exactly the political objectives are here. They've replaced the political objectives with what I would describe as three military objectives, intermediate military objectives, which are essentially boiled down to degrading Iranian capabilities and capacity. It focuses on its navy, its ballistic missiles and drones, and has gone back and forth about whether that includes nuclear weapons development or not. But these are military objectives, and that still raises unanswered the question of, if you achieve those military objectives, what is ultimately supposed to be the political end state? There has not been clarity on that. Though I would just add that I think at this point in the war, the unstated real objective is ending it, just trying to get out of it at this point.
Okay.
Thank you, Dr. Grieco. So you just very clearly mentioned that the aim was to use the air power in a limited and decisive fashion. In fact, that's what we've been seeing since Gulf War and Gulf War I in 1991, where U.S. intervention across the world has been led by air power. Okay, and subsequently we have had a land power also joining in. So my question is, in this case, is the U.S. relying on air power as a tool for coercion against Iran? And what are the structural limits of air power, in your opinion, structural limits of air power in shaping the behavior of a state like Iran?
Yeah, these are great questions. I wanted to acknowledge just first before answering your question, the point you made about relying on air power since 1991. I think this is sometimes underappreciated, at least here in D.C., the degree to which a U.S. grand strategy of primacy has essentially been underwritten by American advantages in air power. And often taking away some of the wrong lessons, I would argue, from the 1991 Gulf War. But to answer your immediate question, this is a really interesting one. So going in, was this about brute force, to use Schelling's term, that, war fighting, or was it about coercion in terms of their concept of operations? I think it's right at the line early on in this decapitation idea about whether it's brute force or coercion. And to go back to Schelling and his distinction, if it's brute force, you're trying to take away the capacity of the adversary to be able to have a choice in how they respond. And I don't know if they believe that decapitation would be so decisive that it would take away the element of choice and the adversary would have no ability to respond and therefore have to give in to, your will. I think it's probably more likely is coercion, and it was an attempt at coercion, and to do this through air power, through the threat, again, decapitation of showing that you could take out this number of leaders. You could significantly, I think they thought, degrade their strategic and operational capacity. It would cause paralysis, and that any leaders that were to come to replace them essentially would say, we don't want to end up the same way. So we're going to be more accommodating. But the problem with, there are many problems with this theory of victory. One is just that historically, there's not an example where this has worked with air power alone. So there's already good reasons to be skeptical about this approach. And then I think if I were to come up with a list of countries where I was going to insist I'm going to still try this anyway, and that I think this is finally going to be the time that, it's going to work, Iran would be nowhere on that list, because you have a regime that has spent decades essentially preparing for this possible scenario and making the regime resilient. It's not a regime that's based on one individual. It's based on the goal of the regime is for the revolution to survive. And they have made sure that happens because it's bigger than one individual. So there are tons of redundancies in the system at a political level. And even we've seen at a military level as well. It seems after the June war, they learned one of the things was to delegate to local commanders. And so even at an operational level, it's much more resilient. So if that was the idea to coerce here, specifically through regime change, it was not a good case to tempt it.
Yes, it's not worked, obviously. So I would like to, recall Dr. Colin Gray's article in 2007 on air power advantages in future wars. Okay, in fact, in that paper, in the title itself, he bemoans the lack of strategy in the United States. And he states that, somewhere in the conclusion, future wars will be diverse. Therefore, tactical, operational, and strategic value of air power must always be situational. In fact, even Edward Luttwak, too, has commented often that air power application has to be situational. Okay, so has the U.S. application of air power in the instant case has been situational? Or do you feel that high-level decision-making has discounted the importance of joint operations with land power, possibly due to casualty aversion?
Yes, that's a great question. I think one of the things that we've seen throughout, air power was originally, as you know well, sir, the founding myth, if you will, of air power was that it could win air wars alone. And part of that, I think we have to have some degree of sympathy to those interwar theorists because many of them served in the First World War. And the trenches and the devastation, right? So you can imagine why you would not want to see a repeat of that. And so they were looking for this alternative. And then the other part was that they also wanted independent air forces. So they were making a case for that. So I think that's been very powerful. I think, even today in the Air Force, it is part of the joint force. I think there's still some of that mythology that exists. What I would say is, I don't think that it was an attempt to exclude the rest of the joint force because certainly the Army's been playing a role in, air and missile defense, in logistics. The Navy's been playing a role here. But let's be honest, U.S. interests in this war are very limited compared especially to Iran. It doesn't justify a ground invasion in terms of the costs. And of course, Iran knows this. And so you've already are at a disadvantage if you're trying to coerce because they know that you have limited stakes and you're only willing to pay so much in terms of costs. And the threat to escalate in some ways is limited because you really don't want to expand this to a ground war. And that removes some of your leverage, particularly against an adversary for whom this is existential. So, I think the reality is that air power is most effective when it is part of a joint force and it brings incredible capability to a joint force. We may be asking too much of air power in this particular case, or we are certainly asking too much of air power.
Indeed, indeed.
You mentioned about the extensive use of air power and it being effective as part of the joint strategy. But one of the things for, observers like us is that the air strikes have been tremendously successful in many cases. But is there a risk that, tactical success in strikes is sort of being interpreted as strategic progress, especially by the president?
Yes, I mean, I think that we have good evidence at this point of that. I will just say as an observation, of the last 30 years, with a couple exceptions, this has been the problem in all of the U.S. wars. Has been sort of like this tactical, even operational success, but not being able to convert it to strategic level success. Right? This is the story in Afghanistan. It's the story in Iraq after 2003, and sadly, this is another example of it. What I see here is a couple things. I think one way to frame it is, I think in some ways the United States and Israel have been waging what I would call a war of destruction as their strategy. And that it's based on this idea, it's essentially in some sense a punishment strategy, not in the way that Duhay talked about it, but more that we can raise the cost sufficiently, destroy enough capability and capacity of Iran, make it so costly, and essentially threaten regime survival, that ultimately they'll decide that they can't continue this war. It's not worth continuing this war because they're losing so much capability and capacity, and they want to be able to make sure they have enough for regime survival. And so they are very focused, in a sense, on their metric, which is how much capability capacity they're destroying. And at the same time, I think Iran is in some sense saying that war doesn't matter very much because we just need to have sufficient enough left that we're actually able to wage what is our war that we think is more important, which is the war of disruption. So our ability, we just need to get enough in the air every day to be able to keep the Strait of Hormuz closed so vessels won't pass it, the Navy won't escort them, and that we can continue to put pressure on Gulf states through these attacks, raising the costs on hosting U.S. forces. And they ultimately think their war of disruption will prove more important than the American-Israeli war of destruction. I think they're right, actually, in that calculus. And so one of the, though, I think the challenges is if you're trying to evaluate how you're doing in the war, I think we've been focusing a lot on the metrics for what works for our own strategy and not looking at the metrics of that are working for the Iranians. Like how yes, our strategy might be working, But the Iranian strategy is also working every day that the Strait of Hormuz has remained closed. And so there, and then ultimately, which of these is more important in like evaluating which is more important. And so, all of these briefings that they do at the Pentagon have been, here's how many targets we've hit every day. Okay, I'll just say, does it not remind you of Vietnam? The US and Vietnam, and talking about, body counts and bombs dropped. And, how has that brought you closer to actually achieving, a break in Iran's willingness to resist? There's no evidence of that, but they've become very focused on that metric. The one thing that I think might be useful here is, because they're obsessed with that metric, is that it allows them to declare victory in the war that they waged. And it might allow then Iran to declare victory in its war of disruption, and for both sides to basically say, we won here, so we can stop. Even if, it's not entirely true, maybe that will be how we're able to get out of this.
So we began the discussion by stating that U.S. has been trying to coerce a regime change in Iran. Okay. And just brought out that the plan to achieve this has been through destructive punishment as a strategy, okay, by raising the costs to Iran. So can we distinguish between Airpower that imposes costs through punishment, and at the same time, Airpower that actually achieves coercive leverage through its punishment? Can we distinguish between the two in this operations?
I think you can, but you're looking at different metrics, which I think is what you're perhaps getting at. Yeah. And that the first one would be, the number of things you're just destroying. The second would be, okay, if you're destroying these things, what effect is it supposed to have? That is supposed to be the causal mechanism that's supposed to reduce their willingness to fight. And so, and that has not been articulated, at least publicly, what those in between things we're looking for are. And so if it's Iran's willingness to, stop, charging in the Tehran toll booth, that's not working. If it's a sign, some of this is that it would probably be signs that are not as public. It might be that there are changes in their negotiating position, might lead you to think that this is working. They're going to be, one of the things maybe challenging here is they are softer metrics, right? They're not, it's easy to count the number of bombs dropped and make it very quantitative. And you can imagine on a PowerPoint slide, the things that you would need to really evaluate if this is working at a coercive level are things that are much softer and harder to evaluate, and much more in the realm of like intel and of what you can get in terms of the decision making, which is harder to evaluate.
Yep.
Yeah, that's, but you have sort of highlighted how the Iranians have done a very good job also in defending their interest. In fact, I had written an analysis on this some time back in War on the Rocks. So one of the things I wanted to sort of understand from you is, even if Iran's capabilities are less sophisticated than China's, do you think their layered sort of effects, that is drones, missiles, proxies, and geography, create a sort of meaningful denial problem for the US operations, using a modification of the A2AD strategy?
Yeah, so this is the thing that I'm thinking a lot about right now, actually, is in the same way that you phrased it. In many respects, they're running China's playbook, in terms of what the Chinese write about and where they've invested, but it's a less sophisticated version and not at the same scale. And so, I hate to say this, if I was in Beijing right now and I was a strategist, I would be like, okay, we've got some validation here. I think that we're seeing, so what does that mean though, in terms of, what are to take away about, does this work for denial? I think, yes, if I were in Beijing, I would be seeing good evidence for this. And I see it in two things that I think matter in terms of exposing two particular US vulnerabilities around denial. I think the first one, and this is one that we were aware of, but yet still not fully prepared, is the vulnerability of the airbase.
Correct.
And the aircraft on the ground. And I don't think, it's an accident that they, in particular, when they struck these bases, they've done damage, that it was tankers on the ground. that they, destroyed or damaged severely, and the E3, that they're large aircraft, on the ground, right? That are harder to even, more quickly get into the air if you have some warning. But what's more interesting to me is I think if you look back at their targeting, and I'm talking using open source, it is very systematic. It is not random targeting. They basically went after the enabling layer of US air power. So they went after the radars, and we've seen they've gotten actually some, very expensive radars they've taken out. So it makes their attacks more likely to, be able to come through, to actually, their drones and missiles to actually reach their targets. They went after communications, including some satellites, terminals, things like that. And then they went after the refuelers, which are critical in this campaign because the distances at which we're operating, you need aerial refueling. And so they went after the aerial refuelers, and then they went after the E3, which cannot, understate how important, how big that was, especially because we have a limited number already. And that plays a critical role in terms of coordination of the battle. And I think this has to be particularly important too, because we have so many actors involved in this air battle at this point. Gulf states in a defensive role, Israel as well. And so critical enabler in terms of your ability to know what's happening, in the airspace, and also to coordinate it. And I think it tells you something about what they recognized as a vulnerability. Did that give them air superiority? No. But what it did is show that they could really raise the costs. And it's also potentially, I would have to think, it has forced some dilemmas on to US commanders. Where do you operate those E3s now that still remain? Are you willing to keep them at forward bases? Are you going to pull them back? But as you all know, when you pull it back and you're at range, then it reduces the time, potentially on station. And I think it's the same thing with the tankers. I know we have a lot of tankers compared to everyone else in the world, but they're old and they're not, we don't have clear replacements, on the horizon. We have the, KC-46 and things like that, but it has a lot of problems. And these are older aircraft that we're pushing them really hard. That's the other thing. And so I think what they've shown, though, is that they've been able to, unfortunately, down some US aircraft, as we all know. But what I think they've shown is that at least for them taking on the United States in the air war, it's actually been more effective for them to go after the fixed point, the base, as a vulnerability. And the Chinese write explicitly about this. They talk about air power as a system, and about how you need to defeat the enemy's air system, meaning like they don't think of it as like fighter and fighting a fighter, right? As like necessarily the important thing. It's about like what's the whole system that enables that. And so where are the weak points? And they see the US base as a weak point, and they're right. And I think that's been validated. And now you can imagine China doing this at much greater scale and sophistication. And I've done that analysis. And I can tell you, looking at the Indo-Pacific, even when you try to disperse as the United States, in at least the first 72 hours of a war, if China were to dedicate its missiles to attacking runways, we would not be able to operate for probably the first 3 days. And that's if they do it dumb. Meaning like they're basically like, okay, we know it takes you 10 hours to repair a runway. So every 10 hours, we're just going to hit every runway. We're not even going to try to figure out where you are. So I think that's been validated. And then the other piece of this, I would just say in terms of denial, is I think they've shown air denial is more decisive than air superiority in the sense of where it is. Air denial over the Strait of Hormuz has proven more decisive in this war than air superiority over Tehran. And it's because of the effect it can generate, and it's able to disrupt the ability of commerce. And so if you have air, and that air denial is not at 30,000 feet for them there, it's really at lower altitudes. It's primarily this missile and drone threat, that's, well below 15,000 feet even. But it's also, again, where the United States is not prepared for that fight because our Air Force has prioritized the fight at 30,000 feet and not the lower altitude one. And essentially they're saying, we're going to go around you. And we're making it contested and dangerous at this lower altitude, and we're not prepared for it. So those are two vulnerabilities if you're watching right now and observing. I think China and other adversaries are going to exploit.
Could you just elaborate a bit more about how China is likely to interpret this conflict? as a kind of demonstration of US capability and the limits of US power projection and even escalation control. How would you sort of see, you spoke about it a bit, but if you could elaborate on how do you think China will apply its anti-access area denial strategy based on the lessons learned from, the US-Israel operations against Iran?
Yeah. So, I made this point to some people after Venezuela. And there were some people here in the US that, essentially said, like, look what we did in Venezuela. It proves like how great American air power is, and it was an impressive operation for sure. I think high risk, I just want to say, but an impressive operation. And I was asked this question by a number of reporters, like, what would you take away if you were China? And the reason I'm bringing it up is because my answer is very similar to your question here, looking at Iran. And I would say, I'm not, in some respects, from an air perspective, I don't think those operations are actually all that impressive in a certain way, because essentially it ran the 1991 playbook. We had basically months and years to prepare, to gather intelligence on targets, to bring in assets, build up assets. And when we had a high level of confidence that we would be able to had enough forces in place and a high level of confidence that we could actually go after air defenses and conduct a seed mission with a high probability of success, we then decided to initiate operations. The problem with that is if you're watching that and you're China, you're going to say, well, I'm not going to give you that opportunity to build up your forces and to take the initiative. The problem would be in most of the contingencies we imagine, if there was one in the Indo-Pacific, China is more likely to initiate. And so how applicable is that? And then I think the other thing I would just say is the difference in sophistication, I think, is really important here too. And just in terms of, like the capabilities for air defense, that the Iranians had. I mean, and not a serious air-to-air threat, or at least in the sense of the traditional air-to-air threat in terms of, with all due respect, Top Gun, the fighters the Iranians had, right? Are old compared to, U.S. fighters. So I think that would be one of the big things I would be taking away if I were China, is that don't allow the United States to run its playbook. And then to exploit the vulnerabilities in that existing playbook, which are quite clear, like based on what I said earlier around, base defense and things like that, and the lower altitude airspace. And then I think that the third one I would say is one of the things Iran has done is it's demonstrated that it is costly to be potentially a U.S. ally and partner who hosts U.S. forces.
Yeah.
I think it can't be emphasized enough that the Gulf states lobbied privately in Washington before this war against it. Many made public statements saying that they were restricting, U.S. access, that they wouldn't be allowed to be used for offensive operations. And yet they still are on the receiving end of Iranian drone and missiles. And, from an Iranian strategy perspective, I understand why. But if you were a Gulf state, you're now paying the cost for hosting U.S. forces. And I would think that on an issue that you may not see as, that you have limited interest at, right? Limited interest. If you were an ally or a partner in the Indo-Pacific, I have to think you're looking at this and with this visual reminder and thinking seriously about that. Particularly if it's a Taiwan scenario where vast majority of countries, allies and partners in the Indo-Pacific have very, very limited interests in a Taiwan scenario. That, thinking seriously about the costs, risks, and benefits. And I expect after this war, you're going to see Gulf states reconsidering some of this.
Dr. Kelly, it's interesting that you brought out in the instant operations, the fact that air denial has turned out to be more decisive than air superiority. But this template may not be applicable to all conflicts. That's one thing that we would need to understand. And frankly speaking, U.S. so far, U.S. air power, both naval and Air Force air power, has been focusing on counter value and counter force, except possibly the Iranian army. So you have decimated the Iranian missile forces to about 70%. That's been the claim. And obviously, Iranian Air Force does not exist. Okay, the Navy to some extent does still. But do you, in case you foresee the hostilities necessitating a set of ground operations, U.S. needing to launch ground operations, one would expect that the nature of air operations, the missions would change to support the ground operations. Do you think that's going to happen, or will they still continue to focus on counter value and counter force operations?
Yeah. So first of all, thank you for saying that about air superiority. I do agree with you that I think it is context dependent in terms of which is more decisive, air superiority or air denial. And part of that depends on your goals. If you're trying to conduct an offensive mission and your goals are revisionist, you need, for most offensive operations, you need air superiority. Whether blockade scenarios or attacking on land, right? I think if, for example, if Russia had air superiority in the war against Ukraine, I think we would be seeing a very different outcome on the battlefield. So I think that's a really important point to mention, that it depends on your goals too. This question about land operations, I mean, some part of me as an analyst wants to resist it, answering it in the sense of like, let's not do that. Let's not do an invade granny ground operations. And I think, we obviously that's been seriously considered based on reporting, right? Karg Island or these islands that are in the strait itself, or going in and trying to extract the uranium itself. So what would happen in terms of that kind of mission? I mean, I think the first thing is you would see, I think, a much more concentrated air campaign, like seed campaign, around wherever this is supposed to would be happening, right? If it's Karg or, somewhere else. And I think to much more concentrated to try to, as much as possible, eliminate threats, because some of these are also going to now be shorter range. It's going to be hard. This is the challenge. It would be really hard to do this because of the range of some of these things. Like Karg Island, I think is 25 kilometers from the Iranian mainland. So the number of like drone missile threats would be, and even artillery would be really high. So I think you would see a focus on trying to protect forces with air power, suppressing threats and supporting ground forces and like that traditional joint mission. But I don't think the United States would be able to completely just focus on that and abandon the counterforce and countervalue mission, in part because it would still have to also be thinking about, presumably Iran would begin firing missiles again at, Israel and the Gulf states. And so it would have to be conducting, larger air campaign to try to find these ballistic missiles and drones as well throughout the country. And at least from what we hear in reporting, the Iranians, not unsurprisingly, have been busy digging out in the last couple of weeks.
Yeah. So interesting. In fact, that would be a place that US may not want to go, I'm sure. Okay, expansion of war into larger ground operations. So coming back to the fact that it started off as a coercive action largely, and a limited war. Right? That's what we expected it to be. In fact, it's limited in certain aspects still. So if this conflict is understood as a test case for coercion and limited war, what do you think would actually look like success for the United States? What would be considered as success or victory for the United States? And is the outcome realistically achievable if you define what is going to be victory?
Yeah. So, one thing I think people in thinking about, using this as a test case for aerial coercion, is worth acknowledging that the biggest ask was made here, regime change. And so, I don't think we should take away that like air power can't play an effective role in coercion. The lesson you should take away is what you ask of it to achieve should be far more limited. Like you're putting limited means with a really ambitious goal. That's a mismatch. So, I think a more limited, ask, we would have been more successful in using air power in a limited way. So at this point, in some sense, let's be honest, because of the way this was set up, anything short of regime change is in some sense a defeat. And every day, frankly, that the Strait of Hormuz remains closed is a defeat for the United States. I don't think there's any realm around which, I know we can spin this politically, but this is a strategic defeat. And the degree, in some sense, it's the degree to which and how much. What I would say is that for the United States to get some level of success or to be able to tell a story that there was some success, it needs to be that you get a deal, some kind of deal, diplomatic deal, that at least some of the terms look better than maybe JCPOA, the original nuclear deal, whether it's, a longer term of, a moratorium, but something in the deal that you can spin. But I'm using the word spin here, which should tell you something, right? But it would have to be, I think, something around a deal, around potentially the nuclear issue. I mean, I'm curious what you guys think, but this notion that restricting ballistic missiles, does this seem like a viable one in general? Like just in general, like, isn't this essentially asking disarmament? Or do you think that we're headed in a direction where people are going to try to do arms control around ballistic missiles? Ranges and things.
No sovereign nation would accept such a condition. Oh, so I find that this is yet another example of strategic leadership not understanding limitations of air power, what it can do and what it cannot do, and just assuming that technology and the precision can achieve strategic objectives which are actually non-achievable. I mean, a typical example is what happened in 2006, Israeli operations against Hezbollah. That's where I would say non-achievement of objectives by a superior player has turned out to be a victory for the lesser adversary. I think Anil will have a final question here.
No, I just had a couple of questions. One, it's sort of at the tactical level, and one at the grand strategic level. So I'll ask the tactical one. I studied, the Iranian missile campaign and their drones, how they use that. So I have a sort of fundamental question. Do low-cost platforms such as drones and missiles, do they change the nature of air operations which a country wages? And do they sort of create a new paradigm in which the asymmetry which was possible, when a country had high cost, high capability platforms, you had the F-35, and the others don't have that. Do you think that has changed now?
Yes, absolutely. Max Bremer and I have written extensively about this point, that it doesn't make the advantage that you have with, say, an F-35 irrelevant. Let's be clear. But what I think the really big picture change here is around the democratization of air power. And that in the past, air power has always been expensive, and it keeps going up. But in order to be a major air power, because you can't just have like some fighter aircraft. You need a whole set of capabilities, right? And they're all expensive. The fighter aircraft, ideally bombers, right? ISR platforms, early warning, support aircraft, right? And I'm keeping adding to the picture here. And then you need highly trained, pilots, which pilots are expensive to train. You need, skilled maintainers, right? Intelligence analysts. Like, I'm just adding things to really be effective with air power. And as you can imagine, the number of countries that can actually do that is relatively small, because that's all really expensive. And it requires a lot of scientific base, industrial base, and a financial base for that.
And money.
Yeah, and money. And because we've been trying to gain advantage through the quality of the aircraft, the technology, these aircraft keep getting more and more expensive every time we build new ones. I think it's about 2.5 times as expensive for a new version of an older, like a new fighter. Is every time we upgrade, it's about 2.5 times as expensive, probably more, even more now. And so that's limited the number that could actually access the airspace and compete in it. And what I think we're seeing is that the number of countries that can still compete, particularly, in the fighter in a symmetric way, is still relatively limited. But far more actors, state and non-state, now have access to drones and missiles, and they're able to use those to contest the airspace. Like, they can't gain air superiority, but they can contest it, and they can deny air superiority to the other side. And we've seen multiple demonstrations now of that, everything from the Islamic State to, of course, Iran. Ukraine is using air denial to basically keep itself in the war. And so I think that we've had multiple demonstrations, and I think this is a big change because it means two things. One, for the militaries that have traditionally had this huge air advantage, They now have to think about it being, or at least parts of the airspace being contested and what to do about that. And it matters a lot for surface forces as well. I remember an Army officer I know, a colonel, who was about to retire and had been at the recapture of Mosul, advising the Iraqis. And he had done, I think, at least 5 tours throughout the global war on terror, Afghanistan and Iraq. And he said at the recapture of Mosul, it was the first time he had ever had an enemy that presented an air threat. The Islamic State was using quadcopters. They were that was the first time they were doing that, quadcopters, and modifying them with grenades and mortars and dropping them on command posts. And it was so bad that it actually shut down Iraqi operations for 4 days. And he said, 5 tours, and he had seen a lot of combat. He said, I had to think about an enemy in front of me, an enemy behind me, an enemy on my sides, but I never had to look to the sky. And he said, and just from a cognitive perspective, he told me, I'm glad I'm retiring, he said, because war's really hard. And he said, I don't know how I would add that component cognitively in to how I manage, the battle. And so this is new, that we have to think about this for the first time in a really, really long time. And I think I think that the other piece I'll just add is mobility matters a lot. And the launcher numbers that we've destroyed, for example, of Iran, they seem to keep getting revised down. And we've had trouble, obviously, finding, the drones because they're dispersed. And so I would just say that, the ground to air threat, I think, continues to be one that is highly problematic. There's still the air to air issue, but the surface based threats to aircraft. And that's how Iran has, shot down an F-15. Damaged an A-10. That's one that I think can continue to be a real challenge.
As a corollary, and since I did not want to leave the Navy out of it, there has been some debate in India, and I'm sure in other places, regarding the viability of aircraft carriers in such a kind of scenario. So what are your thoughts on it, and what do you suggest?
Yeah, so I want to share with you a story that an Indian admiral actually pointed this out to me once, and I was it blew my mind. And asking him a question about this, and he said, well, you do, he pointed out to me, India, we use our aircraft carrier in a very different way from you. Americans, you use it to project power on land. And so you're actually often trying to bring the carrier closer to land where all of these threats are based. He said, that's not really what India is trying to do. We're actually trying to take it away from land with our carrier to be able to project power into the Indian Ocean and project, basically to keep the adversary from coming as close to our shores. And it blew my mind when he said that, because I was like, oh, wow, that is such an important distinction. And how these two militaries or navies are using their carriers. India's makes more sense in this age compared to the United States. And I think it's notable, right? The carrier has been staying back. It's not in the Gulf, that's for sure. It's been pulled back, to relative safety. I don't know how much we can take away about the vulnerability of the carrier from this, in part because we don't have good information about what kind of aerial threats the carrier has or hasn't faced. At least in open source, I haven't been able to see anything, right? To know they said something about they've tried to strike, U.S. ships. I don't know to what degree. So it's hard to know, but at the very least, what we've seen is that the threat from Iran has had an effect in pushing the carrier back. But I think there's something to be said, though, about India's approach and thinking about using the carrier more in open waters to push an adversary away from your own shores. So it may be situational is part of the answer about the relevance of the carrier. And I would just say, finally, that also what we mean by the carrier maybe has to change over time. Right? Right now, it's we think, the carriers are really a carrier group. Yeah. But, there's the piece that we think of as the carrier. That's the really big piece. There are ways that you can potentially make the carrier group more resilient by taking some of the capabilities that are off the carrier and dispersing them among the group more. And I expect that that's what we're going to see over time, so that you don't have the chance of a catastrophic loss in the same way that you would now, whether it's some of the support functions or, the Navy's trying to figure out like what to do with CCAs, the collaborative combat aircraft. Like, where are you going to put those on the carrier? My answer is, well, maybe you should be putting it on another ship or set of ships, so that everything is not there. But yeah, that's not probably a particularly satisfying answer, but in flux.
Absolutely. There are so many lessons which are emerging from this, and it'll take some time to understand that. And like you said, many of us took wrong lessons from the 1991 air campaign. So similarly, we'll have to be careful when we, analyze and finalize our thoughts on what happened here. So we come to the termination of this podcast. And I would really like to thank you so much for sharing your thoughts and your wisdom. If there is anything more that you would like to add, it's most welcome, actually.
Well, first of all, thank you for having me. It's been a really fun conversation. Really appreciated the questions, which forced me to also think harder about these issues. I would actually like to ask you both a question, if I may.
Of course.
And just, what do you think the United States should take away as the lesson from this war? As outside observers, watching this, what do you think are the big takeaways, specifically for the United States?
I would like to state that, as you said, United States took the wrong lessons from 1991 Gulf War and even the subsequent operations in a way. Number one, United States in the past few decades has been fighting air war in uncontested airspace. So frankly speaking, the rest of the world cannot draw the right lessons from these operations. That's number one for me. Number two is that air power alone cannot achieve victory. Okay, if you want to achieve objectives, it has to be an integrated or joint operations. Okay, air power can destroy targets, it can destroy enemy leadership and the things. But if you have a resilient civilization, a resilient population, who's willing to suffer and who's willing to withstand the losses and still fight, you will need ground operations. So if you are averse to casualty, that's going to be a big challenge for you in achieving your realistic objectives. Third, what has been visible in most of US operations since after World War II, has been that you're brilliant in conducting operations, planning operations, but conflict termination and post-conflict management have been actually, I would say, less than satisfactory as far as United States operations are concerned, as different from various other options. I would like to bring in the Operation Sindoor that we had last year against our Western neighbor. Whatever the world might say, we focused on achievement of objectives, you achieved objectives, and you call it off. That's it. So we didn't expand the conflict because the focus was on teaching a lesson, taking out certain targets. That was achieved and called it off. Okay. So conflict termination and post-conflict management are extremely important. And that has to go into the strategic planning right in the beginning of the operations itself.
Excellent. That's very useful.
Yeah. My sort of thoughts, which, are operating at the foreign policy and grand strategic level, are firstly the decision-making which led to this war. That, I think, was done in haste and it was not fully thought through. And the motivations itself appear to be somewhat unclear. So there is a very laid down and excellent national security decision-making process which the United States has, with the principals and the various agencies getting together and then deciding what to do. I think that process has to be followed. And even no country, including the United States, can suddenly embark on this scale of military operations, without due preparations. Within 15 days, the Pentagon had floated tenders for, shelters. You can't have that situation. The second is, I think somewhere there has been a lack of intelligence appreciation as to wargaming, as to what exactly Iran would do. Now, what I would draw attention to is last year, there was a tremendous intelligence successes when the Israelis and the United States managed to eliminate leadership. You could eliminate parts of their program, and so on and so forth. If that level of penetration was there, how is it that the US and Israel did not know Iran's playbook if attacked? I mean, Iran has been preparing for this for a long time, but so has the United States. So politically, but I also feel a military appreciation was not perhaps comprehensive enough to sort of understand these nuances. The third is, again, the appreciation of Iran's behavior when attacked, that is specifically the targeting of the Gulf states and the foreign policy implications of that. If that had not been considered, it actually represents a major drawback in appreciation, actually. Because if your allies are going to get attacked in such a manner and exert this kind of indirect pressure, then I think it's a major drawback. Similarly, the choking of the Straits of Hormuz, I believe it was appreciated earlier that this could be a strategy which the IRGC would use. If that was the case, and one of the methods was mine laying, why is it that the US does not have effective mine layers in the Persian Gulf? Whatever were there were being scrapped in Norfolk. They weren't replacement ones. So I don't know. While there is a kind of political failure in the decision making, I mean, it was suboptimal. I think there are certain issues as far as the military appreciation was concerned also. And finally, I would like to add that, the civil-military relationship has to be healthy. The executive and the president must listen to what or at least pay attention to what his military advisors are saying. And I think he did not pay full attention to, what the chairman and his people were saying. And that's how you have this strategic sort of stalemate obtaining.
Thank you. Those are all, I think, thoughtful points. And I think there's going to be a lot of work here in the United States, I hope, to try to understand this both at a strategic and an operational level.
Thank you very much for your time. It was a wonderful hearing you, and I'm sure that our listeners will really appreciate it.
Great. Thank you so much. I really enjoyed being here.
Thank you, Dr. Kelly, for you.
If you liked our show, dive into Takshashila's research on technology, strategy, and economic affairs. Check us out at our Twitter handle @TakshashilaINST or our website takshashila.org.in.